In this lecture video, we will go over the brain. Now, the brain is a very complicated organ, and we can spend many hours talking about the structures and functions of the brain. However, I will try to simplify things as much as possible in this lecture video. So the central nervous system begins as a hollow tube. Remember, the central nervous system includes your brain and your spinal cord. And it remains hollow. Your brain is hollow, and so is your central nervous system. There's a hollow cavity found in the center of your brain and in the center of your spinal cord, and it is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So during development, you have this neural tube that's going to have these three enlargements. This enlargement over here is called the prosencephalon, which becomes the forebrain. This middle enlargement here is the mesencephalon, which becomes the middle brain, and then this enlargement down here is the rhombencephalon, which becomes the hindbrain. The rest of this tube becomes the spinal cord. Now, as this tube develops, here it is over here, these are some of the primary phases of development. It will develop to a structure like this. The prosencephalon will become the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The telencephalon becomes the cerebrum. This is this large area of brain that you see when you take it out, that big portion, that's the cerebrum. So the telencephalon becomes the cerebrum. The diencephalon will become the thalamus, hypothalamus, and epithalamus. These are located in the center portions of the brain. The mesencephalon will just remain as mesencephalon, and it will form the midbrain section of the brainstem. And then the rhombencephalon becomes the metencephalon, which will become pons and the cerebellum. And then myelencephalon will become the medulla oblongata. We will talk about this. This is right below the spinal cord. And again, the rest of this tube becomes the spinal cord. This is all we're going to talk about in terms of central nervous system development in this video. So we talked about these different portions, and you could see development in, for example, 5 weeks of development. Here's this tube. You could see the telencephalon, 13 weeks, 26 weeks, and at birth. And as you can see, the telencephalon is going to be that portion that really grows a lot during development, and it will become these cerebral hemispheres right here. So if I use the term telencephalon, I'm really talking about these cerebral hemispheres. So let's take a look at the hollow space that is found inside the brain. You should remember these terms for your lab exam. So inside the brain, there's going to be a hollow space, and the portions that are enlarged are going to be called ventricles. The ventricles are going to have names. So it looks something like this. We're looking at the brain here from the anterior view, and here it is from the lateral view. First, you see these two C-shaped ventricles right here. These are called the lateral ventricles. Now, you could get really specific about different anatomical parts. They have like an anterior horn, a posterior horn. I don't want you to worry about that. The only thing I need you to remember is that these two structures here are the lateral ventricles, and they're going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, as we move to the center portion of the brain, we get into this enlargement right here called the third ventricle. This is going to be in the center portion of the brain. Again, it's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. If you follow it down, it will become this narrow tube right here, or canal. This is called the cerebral aqueduct. And then down here, it will form another enlargement called the fourth ventricle. You could see them also on this model. This model represents the ventricles. So we have the lateral ventricles, the third ventricle, the cerebral aqueduct, and the fourth ventricle. Again, this is representing a hollow space that is in your brain, and it's going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Now, the brain isn't just sitting in the skull by itself. It's going to be surrounded by several protective layers, and these are called meninges of the brain. So first, let's look at all of the structures that are protecting the brain. So you could see, for example, the scalp here. You could see some connective tissue below the scalp, and then you have the skull. And right below the skull, you're going to have this tough layer, tough connective tissue. It's made out of dense connective tissue. This is called the dura mater. The dura mater means tough matter, so it's a tough layer, and it helps keep the central nervous system in place. On this diagram, you'll see 2 layers to the dura mater. You don't need to worry about that, but you do need to know what the dura mater is. Below the dura mater, you're going to find another layer, another meninge. This one over here, the purple layer, this is called arachnoid matter. And arachnoid matter is not going to be as tough as the dura mater. When you take the brain out, you'll notice that it is surrounded, if you pull out the dura mater, it's still going to be surrounded by this tissue that sort of looks like a saran wrap covering the organ. That is the arachnoid matter. Now, if you look right below the arachnoid matter, you'll notice there's some space right here. You'll notice the space over here. This is called the subarachnoid space. And the subarachnoid space is going to be filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So you find cerebrospinal fluid in the central nervous system, but also surrounding it. The cerebrospinal fluid comes from the blood. Now, if we go deeper, you find another layer, and this is called the pia mater, which means soft matter. So this light blue layer that's touching the brain, and it's impossible to separate it from the brain, this is called the pia mater. And again, it's soft. So all these layers of meninge are going to be continuous in the brain, but also in the spinal cord. You find these layers surrounding the brain and the spinal cord. So you could have cranial meninges and you could have spinal meninges. You've heard of people getting meningitis. Well, meningitis is infection that occurs in the meninges, and it can cause fluid to build up in these cavities over here, put pressure on the brain, and damage tissues of the brain. So again, here is the dura mater. Now the dura mater is going to fold in on the brain on certain areas. So there's the falx cerebri, tentorium cerebelli, and falx cerebelli. So if we open up the skull, this is what it looks like. This is what you'll see. There's a tough layer covering the brain. This is called the dura mater. So this top portion of the brain, that large portion of the brain that you see, that's called the cerebrum. The layer of dura mater that covers the cerebrum and folds in between the 2 hemispheres of the cerebrum, this is called the falx cerebri. Now there's going to be a layer of dura mater also covering the cerebellum. The cerebellum is like that little structure that you see below the brain. Sort of looks like a small brain. The dura mater is going to surround that as well, and it's going to fold in between the 2 hemispheres of the cerebellum, and that's called falx cerebelli. Now, the dura mater also folds in between the cerebrum and between the cerebellum, somewhere right here, and that's going to be called tentorium cerebelli. Again, these are all just different parts of the dura mater. We talked about the arachnoid, which is going to be softer, much softer than the dura mater, and it's going to be directly beneath the dura mater. And it contains the subarachnoid space, which is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. Again, this purple over here, that's arachnoid, and below that space is the subarachnoid space. And if we take a look at the brain, you'll notice like right here, you don't see dura mater in all of it, but right here you could see that the brain is sort of like covered with this tissue, kind of like a saran wrap. That's the arachnoid matter. It's kind of like a white film sort of over it. That's arachnoid matter. Now, if you pull arachnoid matter off, what you'll see is something that looks like this. So you see all the folds of the brain and they all look shiny. That's the pia mater. The pia mater, just think about it as just that shiny surface that's on top of the brain, and you can't separate it from the brain. So we talked about the telencephalon. This is the part of the tube that goes through a lot of enlargement, and it forms the cerebral hemispheres. So this will include like cerebral cortex, cerebral white matter, and cerebral nuclei, and we'll talk about what these are. So if we look at the brain, the human brain right here, this whole thing, this is the cerebrum, this is the cerebellum, this we'll go over the brainstem and the midbrain portions and everything like that. But what you'll notice is, let me go back. First of all, the cerebral hemispheres are going to have three basic regions: cerebral cortex, cerebral white matter, and cerebral nuclei. So let's look at that. If we cut a portion of the brain and look at it right here, you'll notice that there's going to be parts that appear dark, and there's darker, and then there's going to be parts that appear white. Well, the parts that are darker, they're called gray matter, and they're formed by portions of neurons that are not myelinated. The white matter, the reason why it appears white is because it is formed from portions of neurons that are myelinated. And then, so this portion out here, the surface portion that's gray, this is called the cerebral cortex. And remember, cortex is in anatomy is usually things that are more superficial parts of the organ. So here's the cerebral cortex. This is the cerebral white matter. And then you'll also notice that there is cerebral nuclei, right? So here's cerebral nuclei. And if we take a look at this, we'll notice that there's these chunks of like gray matter in the center of the brain right here. These are nuclei. These are called cerebral nuclei. And they're going to be made out of, again, unmyelinated portions of neurons. Now, the nuclei are oftentimes involved with things that are more subconscious and in some ways like more primitive parts of our brain. We will talk about the nuclei more. So these are layers of the cerebrum. Now let's go back. We could see here that the telencephalon, so basically the cerebral hemispheres, are going to form the superior part of the brain, and they make up 83% of the mass of the brain. So by mass, they make up majority of the brain. They're going to contain ridges called gyri and grooves called sulci. And then the deep grooves are called fissure. So let's take a look. Here we could see a brain from the superior view. And I'm going to go ahead and draw on this. So the parts that are bulging out, right here, see how this is bulging out, all this, and all this, the parts that are sticking out, this is called the gyri. And then there's grooves right here, the parts that are folded in. And those are called sulci. So let me go ahead and draw on this. So, sulci right here and right here. So this is a sulci. And now you could have sulci that are very deep, and they're called fissure. So, for example, here, this is a fissure. Probably remember the term fissure from when we learned the bones, like superior orbital fissure. A fissure is like a crack or an opening. So this is called the longitudinal fissure, and you should remember this term. It separates the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. And by the way, this is a good place to see like the arachnoid matter. You see this white layer that's covering the brain, that's going to be the arachnoid matter. And on this side, you just see the pia matter, which just makes, you know, the brain shiny when you look at it. But you can't separate the pia matter from the brain. Again, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, just keep in mind, we're always talking about the patient's left and right. Okay, we went over this. So the cerebral cortex is going to be the outermost gray matter making up the superficial aspect of the cerebrum. So all this gray stuff that you see on the surface of the brain, this is going to be the cerebral cortex. And here you have the cerebral white matter, and these are the cerebral nuclei. So there are going to be chunks of like gray matter in the center. Okay, we'll talk more about what the cortex does. We're going to talk about them. But generally speaking, it enables sensation, communication, memory, understanding, and voluntary movement. Now, we need to remember different lobes of the brain, which is not difficult to do because they go along with the names of the cranial bones. So here, the pink, this is going to be the frontal lobe. And then the blue right here, this is the parietal lobe. And then we have the temporal lobe, and then the occipital lobe. So, and there's also another lobe, by the way, that's hidden underneath. So you kind of have to pull apart these two lobes. This is called the insula lobe. So you should remember the name of different lobes of the brain. Now, remember how we talked about the grooves were called sulci on the brain? There's going to be very specific sulci that you're going to have to remember because they separate different parts of the brain. So first you have this sulci right here that is kind of goes across your head like a headband from left to right, and it is going to separate the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So right here, I'm going to draw on top of it. And this is a term to remember, especially for your lab exam. This is called the central sulcus, right here. And it separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. So you should remember that. Another one you should remember is the lateral sulcus, because this sulci right here is going to separate the temporal lobe from the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. So you should also remember this one. And then there's another one over here called the parietal occipital sulcus. And this one is a little bit harder to see. If you like split the brain in half sagittally, it's easier to see it. This is called the parietal occipital lobe because it separates the parietal lobes from the occipital lobe. So do remember these. Do remember the lobes. Now, there's two important gyres here to remember. And remember, gyres are going to be the parts that are sticking out. So this one is called the this one right here, central gyre. This is going to be located on the frontal lobe. And then this one over here, behind it, this is the postcentral gyre, which is located on the parietal lobes. And We'll talk about the functions as well, but as far as naming the structures go, it's important to identify these for your lab exam. Again, insular lobe is hidden underneath. It's kind of in that midbrain portion. So briefly speaking, I'm going to talk about the function of different lobes of the brain. We could get really specific with these, the way the brain is mapped out. Very specific areas do very specific things. I'm going to try to keep things somewhat general here. So the frontal lobe, generally speaking, many parts of it are involved with higher thinking. So they're involved with, for example, voluntary movement, executive function, planning. This is where your personality is. This is where you have intelligent thought. So higher levels of thinking. Most of the frontal lobe is involved with that. Now, at the very front portion of the frontal lobe, you have this area called the prefrontal cortex, and it's right here at the very front. This is going to be one of the last parts of your brain to develop, and it takes a while for it to develop. It can take up to age 25 for this part to develop. So this prefrontal cortex portion is involved with things that are, emotions and types of thinking that are really more involved with humans and not other animals. So, for example, empathy, thinking about consequences, things like that are involved with the prefrontal cortex, planning, personality. So, because this part of your brain takes so long to develop, it is common to see teenagers or younger adults make decisions that are risky, or to see them make decisions without thinking about consequences. And the reason for that is because this part of the brain is not fully developed. So in teenagers, this is still growing. So you may have heard about Phineas Gage if you've taken anatomy before, or maybe you took psychology, abnormal psychology. Phineas Gage, I believe, was a railroad worker, and when he was working, there was an explosion in the area where he was working. So when this explosion happened, he had a metal rod go through his skull and then into his brain, just like you see right here, into his eyes and then into his brain. And he doesn't die. And the reason for that is because this metal rod here was so hot that it basically sealed all of the blood capillaries shut, and he did not bleed to death, and he was alive with this metal rod in his head. He was able to function, perfectly well, walking, talking, eating, things like that. But the only thing that changed after this accident was his personality. What people noticed after this incident was that he was no longer the person that he used to be. So before this accident, he used to be a very gentle person who didn't curse a lot, who was, polite, and then he was patient. And then after he had this accident, he would get very impatient. He had anger. So his personality changed as a result of damage to his frontal lobe and to his prefrontal cortex. So really, this is very fascinating, but it's usually things like this, cases like this, that tell us what specific function an area of the brain has. Again, we talked about the central cortex. Now let's talk, the central sulci right here. Let's talk about, I want to talk about the primary motor cortex. So we talked about the frontal lobe right here. Now on the frontal lobe, there's also this area called the primary motor area. Remember we talked about the precentral gyri, this gyri right here. Well, that's the, that's what the structure is called. But functionally, what is located on this gyri is the primary motor area. We could see it, here's the central sulcus, and then we could see the primary motor cortex right here. Here's the premotor cortex. So the primary motor cortex is going to be involved in, like I said, on the precentral gyri. So as the term implies, motor cortex, this area of your brain is involved with a lot of movements. So motor movements in your body, voluntary movements. And different areas of this gyri correspond to different parts of your body. And it's not equal. So you might think like a larger portion of your body that is large is going to have more areas here associated with it. And that's not true. This has to do with how much movement, how much precise movement are you doing with that portion of your body. So if we think about the areas of our body where we have the most movement, you might think your legs because we walk a lot with our legs, but that's not, even though we walk a lot with our legs, we don't do too many different motions with our legs. The two areas of our body that have a lot of precise movements involved are going to be your hands and also your facial muscles, your lips, and your tongue. We use our hands in many different ways to manipulate objects, to move things. So we're using our hands in so many different motions. And also our mouth and our lips and our tongue to create sounds, to speak, to make facial expressions. So those areas of our body are going to have more areas of this cortex associated with them because we do so many different movements with them. So if we were to create a human based on the amount of cortex that's dedicated to those portions of our body, it would look something like this. You have a huge amount that's going to be dedicated to your hands, a little bit to your leg, and you could see a lot to the lips, the tongues, and the mouth area. So this is called the motor homunculus. Another area that's found on the frontal lobe is the Broca's area. And I believe for most people, it's located on the left side. Yes, most people, or over 90% of people. So Broca's area is associated primarily with mouth movements. So it enables you to speak clearly. So people who have damage to this area of the brain, they will be able to comprehend language and they know what they want to say, but they may not be able to create those sounds or those movements with their mouth so that they could speak clearly. So this can happen sometimes, like if somebody has like a stroke, and if there is damage to Broca's area, they will have problems with speaking. This diagram right here shows you different lobes of the brain. Again, this is important for your lab exam. The frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. So we talked about this central sulci right here. Here's the primary motor cortex that is involved with a lot of motor movements, a lot of precise motor movements. And I do want to mention that this is not the only area of your brain that's going to be involved with movements. There's other areas as well. Now, if we move to the parietal lobes, you're going to have the postcentral gyri right here. And on the postcentral gyri, you have the primary somatosensory cortex. As the term implies, somatosensory has to do with sensing things. So primary somatosensory cortex is located on the postcentral gyri. What this cortex does is that it processes information coming from your skin. So things such as touch, temperature, pain, position, those are going to be processed right here on the primary somatosensory cortex. And if you think about it, if you're trying to feel the texture of something or feel the temperature or sense if something is painful or not, which part of your body do you use? You use your hands. Your hands, the palms of your hands are very sensitive to these things. So you're going to have many areas of your cortex, many areas of this cortex are going to be associated or dedicated to the palms of the hand. So again, we'll take a look at what the homunculus looks like with the somatosensory cortex. You're going to have a lot of it dedicated to the hands and a lot to your lips and to your tongue. So, and by the way, we talked about the motor homunculus and the sensory homunculus. This is the motor, this is the sensory. And even though they look similar, they're actually not exactly the same. Now, on the parietal lobe, you will also find this area called Wernicke's area. It's also slightly in the temporal lobe, and it's always going to be on the same side as the Broca's area. So if you have Broca's area on the left side, which is the case for most people, you will also have the Wernicke area on the left side. This portion of the brain helps with interpretation of language. So remember, just because you are able to hear words or hear sounds doesn't mean that you could interpret what they mean and be able to put the words together to comprehend them. This area over here has to do with word comprehension and language comprehension. So if somebody has damage to this area of their brain, they will have a hard time putting sentences together that actually make sense. So they may not make a whole lot of sense when they're speaking. They may be able to pronounce words properly, but the language will not make much sense. It is also believed that the parietal lobe plays a role in imagination and dreaming, and it has a lot to do with spatial orientation, so it allows you to have a sense of where your body is in space. Okay, we talked about the motor and the sensory homunculus. And this shows you, here's Broca's area, and Wernicke's area will be like kind of right here in between the parietal and the temporal lobes. Remember, Broca's area has to do with the movements, precise mouth movements, so that you can speak and pronounce things. Wernicke's area has to do with language comprehension, so being able to put words together that make sense and being able to interpret sentences and things like that. Now let's move on to the temporal lobe right here on the side. What's interesting about the temporal lobe is that it has many functions with hearing, and you've probably heard that many areas of your brain are crisscrossed. Like if you're doing something with the left side of your body, you're using a lot of neurons on the right side of your brain. Well, there is truth to that, except that with the temporal lobe, that's not the case. So if you're hearing something from the left side, from your left ear, it goes to the left temporal lobe. If you're hearing it from the right ear, it goes into the right temporal lobe. It doesn't have that crisscross going on. The temporal lobe is going to have the primary auditory cortex and the auditory association area. So if we look at them, again, I talked about how the vestibulocochlear nerves from your ears will go into the temporal lobe. So here is the primary auditory cortex right here in this area. So this area, this is the area of your brain that's going to allow you to have a sense of different sounds. So, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you know what they mean. You might hear a certain sound, you might hear a certain voice, you might notice a certain pitch, but there's not necessarily interpretation of those sounds. So you might hear something just with this area. You will be able to hear and notice certain sounds, but not know what they mean. So this primary auditory cortex gives you awareness of sounds. Now the auditory association area is what gathers information from your brain to give meaning to what you're hearing. So this has to do with giving you awareness of the sounds, and this area over here gathers information to give you meaning of what you're hearing, meaning of the words you're hearing and the sounds that you're hearing. The olfactory tracts, which come from your nose, will go through the temporal lobe. You can't see it when we look at it from the side or the top. It's going to be underneath, so it comes very close to it. And also part of the temporal lobe, hidden underneath it, are going to be these structures we're going to talk about called hippocampi or hippocampus. This is part of the limbic system, and there are two tiny structures on the left and the right side of your brain, and they're going to be involved with forming long-term memory and learning. Now, because this is involved with long-term memory, and this is the nerve right here that allows you to have a sensation of smell. Remember, these two are close to each other. They're like right underneath the temporal lobe. Because these two are so close to each other, the sensation of smell is the strongest trigger for memory. So you might smell something and it will like take you back to a certain memory. And that's because these two are so closely located in the brain area. Okay, talked about the auditory association area. Okay, here's the auditory cortex. So the temporal lobe, again, it has multiple functions, but one of its main functions has to do with awareness of sounds, but also interpretation of sounds. Now, on the temporal lobe, you will also find the olfactory cortex right here. And olfactory cortex has to do with sensation of smell. Here's the hippocampi. We'll talk about it again. It's part of the limbic system. And it's found right below the temporal lobe right here. So here, the two green structures. And then if we remove one of the hemispheres, we could see it right here. This will be the hippocampi. And this is involved with development of long-term memory. And it also gives you a sense of time and space. And you could actually look this up, patient HM. You could see the full name now, but they used to call him patient HM because they wanted to protect his identity. So this was a patient who had epilepsy, and to give him treatment, they decided to remove many parts of, his hippocampi. They removed the hippocampus and both of them, so bilaterally, and some other areas around the hippocampus. And what happened is that he lost his ability to form long-term memory. This is patient HM. You could look it up. There is a book. I think it's a biography about him. I haven't looked into it, but you could look into it. And you could see here's the hippocampus right here. Hippocampus for one, by the way. I think it's when you have one of them, it's hippocampus. When you have two together, it's called hippocampi. They removed it. So what happened is prior to his surgery, he was able to have long-term memory. He remembered all the events and things that happened in his life prior to having that surgery. After having that surgery, he was not able to form long-term memory anymore. So every day that he woke up, it was like waking up from that surgery. He remembered everything before the surgery, but after the surgery, there was no more long-term memory. And that is one of the ways, again, you find out what the functions of these areas of the brain are. Now, this is not the only portion of the brain that's involved with forming long-term memory, but it is one of the main ones. At the very back of the brain, you have the occipital lobe. Generally speaking, many areas of the occipital lobe are involved with vision. So on the occipital lobe, you're going to find the primary visual cortex and the visual association area. So the primary visual cortex gives you that sensation and that awareness of visual stimuli. So it allows you to see colors, shapes, dark, light, things like that. But that doesn't mean that you don't necessarily register just with this area what you're looking at. Visual association area will gather that information in your brain, pull information together to give meaning to what it is that you're looking at. So for example, you might be looking at something with primary visual cortex. You might notice that something is clear, it's cylinder shape, and you notice those things. And then visual association area will allow you to identify that object as a plastic cup. I'm going to go back to this. Again, here is the primary visual cortex that gives you awareness of visual stimuli, visual objects. And then here's the visual association area, which will gather information to give meaning to what it is that you're looking at. Now, if we separated the left and the right hemispheres of the brain, this is what we're looking at in the center. The left and the right hemispheres are not completely separated. They're connected to each other by certain structures. One of these structures is going to be the corpus callosum right here. The structure that you see, this is the corpus callosum, and it is made out of bundles of axons. The corpus callosum physically connects the left and the right hemisphere, but it also allows communication between the left and the right hemisphere. The left and the right hemisphere actually are different, not necessarily in structure, but the type of information and the way that you think. You've probably heard of people like being left-brained or right-brained, so functionally they are different. And the corpus callosum allows communication between the two. Now, interesting fact is that women have a bigger corpus callosum than men. Now, sometimes if somebody has many issues with seizures, which is sort of like, you have this electrical thunderstorm going on here in the brain and it can jump around. What they sometimes do is cut a portion of the corpus callosum to basically slow things down, make those seizures less severe. That does affect the way that their left and their right hemisphere are going to communicate. Now, remember when we talked about this right here, we talked about the cerebral cortex and then the white matter, and then you had these islands of gray matter here in the center of the brain. Well, if we look at it from the sagittal view, this is what the gray matter in the center of the brain look like. They form this structure right here. I don't know, it kind of looks like a lizard or something to me. This is called the basal nuclei. It's a very center portion of the brain. So everything that you see here in red is part of the basal nuclei, and then the blue over here are related structures, but they're not part of the basal nuclei. So this is called the caudate nucleus right here. And then here you have the structure that looks like a head. This is going to be called the putamen right here. And then in the center, you're going to have the globus pallidus right here. And here's the amygdala. So amygdala is not technically part of this structure, but it is related to it. it's hard to kind of talk about the specific functions of the basal ganglia because it's involved with a lot of things that are subconscious. But some of the functions will include processing of movement-related information. It's related to the way you also process emotions, motivations, cognitive functions. It is believed to play a key role in reinforcement, so habit formation, learning things by reward and punishment. It's involved in addictive behaviors. Again, a lot of things that come from the basal ganglia are related to a lot of subconscious things that we do. Dysfunctions in the basal ganglia have been associated with disorders that influence movement, such as Parkinson's disease. And the neurotransmitter that's involved here is usually dopamine. Now, another system in this middle portion of your brain is the limbic system. It's not exactly the same thing as the basal ganglia, but it is related in some ways if you look at research. The limbic system is going to include some of parts of it are going to be the thalamus right here in the center portion of the brain. The hippocampus, we talked about this. This is involved with long-term memory, and the amygdala. Here is another picture right here of the limbic system. This is also associated a lot with reward and punishment, learning by reward and punishment. So this is deep within the cortex. It is located both on the left and the right side. One of the things that it does is that it links higher and lower brain functions, helps with establishing emotions, and it is also involved with memory storage and retrieval. So the amygdala, let's first look at that. Here's the amygdala over here. Here's the hippocampus. Here's the amygdala. It's sort of pearl-shaped organ. The amygdala is mainly involved with the control of fear response in your body. It's involved with fight or flight and the way that you regulate fear. And as you can see, it is very close to the hippocampus. So if you, for example, have a bad experience with something once, it will be stored as a memory and it will be easily triggered the next time you come in contact with that thing or you have a similar experience. If you do some research, you will find that the amygdala is highly associated with PTSD and also with things such as panic attack and anxiety disorders. The exact reason for why people get PTSD, why they have panic attacks, the exact reasons are not fully understood, but there have been many research studies that show that it is associated with the amygdala. The amygdala can become hyperactive in certain situations, or it can become hyperactive if you are in danger, if you're in situations of danger many times in your life. So it will become hyperactive. If there is damage to the amygdala, a person who has damage to their amygdala will probably engage in a lot of risky behavior because they don't experience fear when they should be experiencing fear. So their fear response will be diminished. However, what's interesting is that damage to the amygdala can also do the opposite. It can make them fearful when fear is not necessary. They may have responses of fear that are not really appropriate. So damage to the amygdala can cause all sorts of problems. Again, this is really close to that area of your brain where you form long-term memory. So when somebody has a really bad experience or they have PTSD because they have been exposed to violence for a prolonged period of time, they can't simply just shake those things off because those things have been stored in their brain and their brain is ready to respond to those things in fear. The cingulate gyrus, let's go back to this. The cingulate gyrus is this portion right here above, and it's above the corpus callosum. One of the functions of the cingulate gyrus is that it's part of the limbic system that allows you to discern emotions. Let's look at some other areas of the thalamus. So this middle portion here, this is the thalamus. And the thalamus is involved with processing of many sensory information that comes into your brain. So many things, many information that you're processing, before it goes up here to the higher portions of brain, it has to go into the thalamus. So it's a relay station. But what the thalamus also does is that it edits and repackages that information before sending it up here. For example, let's look at this example. You don't remember everything that you see, even though you notice everything that you see. Let's say you come to my office because you want to talk to me about your grade. Now, in that event, you will probably notice things that I have in my office, the color of my clothes, the things that I have on my desk. You will visually see them, you will notice them. But after a week, you're probably not going to remember them because that was not information that was important for your brain to store. But you will likely remember the conversation that we had because that's information that needs to be stored. So your brain has a way of editing things out that you don't really need to remember or even notice. So the thalamus will do a lot of editing and send information coming into different parts of your brain. And then below the thalamus, you have the hypothalamus right here. And the hypothalamus is part of your endocrine system. So the hypothalamus, right here, here's the thalamus, here's the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland. So the pituitary gland is this little gland hanging off the brain over here. Very important gland. It releases at least 8 important hormones for your body. And the release of those hormones is going to be controlled by the hypothalamus. This is sort of like a master gland for your endocrine system. The hypothalamus is also going to be involved with other subconscious and autonomic functions such as salivation, feeding reflexes, circadian rhythms, and subconscious skeletal control. So, however, mainly the hypothalamus is considered an endocrine organ. Now, the pineal gland, located on the backside over here, this tiny little gland here. Pineal gland will secrete melatonin, and melatonin is that hormone that allows you to fall asleep. So it regulates your circadian rhythms. Now you could do some research on this. Some people take melatonin because they believe that it will help them fall asleep faster. So taking it, ingesting it. If you look at some research, there are some research out there that indicate that this might actually be placebo and ingesting melatonin may not cross the blood-brain barrier. So that's something you could do some research on to find out if this is placebo or if it is really an effective supplement. So now let's get to the brain stem. So again, this was the cerebrum, the cerebellum. Then we get here to this middle portion. Most of this is going to be hidden underneath the cerebrum. So here we have the brainstem. Now let's talk about pons. Pons is going to be this portion of the brain that is enlarged over here. It's like on top of the spinal cord and it's an enlargement. It's going to be composed of conduction tracts. One of its functions is that it links the cerebellum and the cerebrum and the spinal cord. So these 3 areas of the central nervous system. It is involved with communication between higher brain and lower brain parts, and it does play a role in dreaming. The medulla oblongata is right above the spinal cord. It's going to contain the cardiovascular center, the vasomotor center, and the respiratory centers. And these are all involved with autonomic functions. So your heartbeat, your breathing, you don't have to think about the fact that you're breathing, and those are all autonomic functions, and they're going to be controlled by the medulla oblongata. So this structure here is involved with regulating many autonomic functions of the body. What I find interesting about the brain is that as you go deeper into the center of the brain, you'll find that many of our primitive functions are more in the deeper center portions, and the outer portions are more involved with complex parts of our brain and parts of our brain that developed later in evolution. Here's the cerebellum, by the way. Remember, this was cerebrum. This is the cerebellum. If we cut the cerebellum, you'll see that it has branchings like this, and those are actually called arbor vitae. Here it is, arbor vitae. It's going to be the white matter inside the cerebellum. So the cerebellum is right below the occipital lobe, posterior to the pons and the medulla oblongata. And it plays a very important role in motor coordination and balance. If you look at YouTube, I believe there's videos of people, like what happens to them if they don't have cerebellum or they have some sort of dysfunction with their cerebellum. What typically happens is that their motor coordination is affected. They're going to have trouble with walking. They're going to have trouble with balance. And the cerebellum is involved with skeletal muscle memory. Now, briefly speaking, the left and the right side of the brain are going to be different. So we talked about people being left brain or right brain. And that doesn't mean you're using one side of your brain. It just means that one side is more dominant than the other. For some people, the left side is more dominant. For some people, the right side is more dominant. So if you're left brain dominant, right here, you tend to be a very analytical person. You like math. You like to follow steps. As you can see here, these are people working in cubicles. So this is a very analytical type of thinker over here. People that are left-brained tend to like order. They need directions to do things. They like to follow steps. And they tend to be good at math. Now, if you're right-brained, you tend to be more good at things such as creativity, such as art. You are a more spontaneous person. You don't like to plan out everything. If that's you, you're a right-brain person. Again, you could be dominant in one or the other side, but that doesn't mean that you're not using both sides of your brain. Again, the left and the right brain are connected, and one of those connections is the corpus callosum. Also, males and females have different brains. Now, they have all these structures we talked about, but the way that information and emotions are processed in a female brain versus a male brain can be very different. Men tend to be more analytical and logical. They have 6 times more gray matter in their brain, so they're good at solving problems. They like to solve problems. They tend to be less emotional, less empathic. They're good with spatial orientation, so giving directions, following directions. They tend to be good at that. They tend to be more territorial, shorter fuses, so more prone to fight or flight, probably anger. They're more likely to have addictions and less likely to be monogamous. Now, females, their nervous system tends to mature earlier. So does the endocrine system for females. Females go through puberty first, and their nervous system develops faster. They are better at working in groups. They tend to be more intuitive, less physical in dangerous situations. They're good at forming memories. And you will notice if you talk to a female, they are much more likely to remember events and to remember specific things about events than men are. They have 10 times more white matter than males. They are better at multitasking. They are better listeners. They're more empathic. And females are more prone to depression. Okay, everyone, this is it for the brain.